Now, if you view morality as a preference, that will undermine your discipline of your kids. I literally just got off a plane 1 hour ago, and now you're making me do this podcast. Now we're back at home recording another Maven Parent podcast. Thank you.
Are you sharing that just so we'll have really low expectations of your contribution to this podcast?
I don't think our audience will ever have low expectations for me, Erin. No, I am tired. I am spent. I spoke all day yesterday. I mean, it was like a 12-hour day, and but I still have more to give. I have more to give.
You're
I'm a giving
giver.
person. I'm a giver. So it was actually in Minnesota, working with a cool group. Actually, I want to tell our audience here what this group does. It's a dad in particular who's started up this group with other dads, and I believe it's like 9 junior high and high school boys. They call it STAC, STAC, which stands for Systematic Theology Apologetics Class. Oh, right. And what they're doing is they're taking these boys, the fathers are taking these boys through some deep theology, different theology books, having them read, watch videos, and they're just training them to know what they believe, why they believe it, and to be able to really know their faith deeply. So went and did some work with them. But it's great. These dads are just meeting regularly with their kids, and they've started now a daughters group. And I asked, are they doing the same things with their daughters? And they said, absolutely. Same exact material, systematic theology and apologetic training.
Oh, that's awesome.
With their daughters. And anyway, so that's where I was doing the Lord's work. But I'm back here now with you to do more of the Lord's work.
And since you've been out of town and I just been home with the kids not doing anything, I have lots of energy. So this should be a really good podcast.
I didn't imply any of that. I'm not sure where you're reading that or you're projecting something onto me.
Oh, sure.
But no, we'll talk to our counselor about it. No, so we are in a series on discipline. We have done 2 podcasts on discipline. And, we actually haven't gotten to like how to discipline. Mm-hmm. Why not? Why haven't you helped these men and women out here, these parents, with the practical aspects of discipline? I think some of them are probably waiting for us to get practical here.
Yeah, they wish they could fast forward maybe to that part. Well, I think because, we have realized in all our years of parenting that you really do have to think more deeply about why you would put your kid in timeout, why you would make your kid eat things they don't want to eat, why you would, really make your kid do anything they don't want to do. Why do we do this? And then, which makes you think about the ideas that you hold about these things, which then makes you think, where did you get these ideas? And are these ideas true? Yeah. And so that's why we went through some of the lies that we can absorb just living in our culture and being influenced by parents around us, by maybe our own parents. So we did focus kind of on those lies because these ideas, if we have these ideas, it'll affect the way that we view our children, that we relate with our children, that we view our authority, all of that.
I think, what we've been saying a little bit and kind of our approach, we can kind of capture it as a worldview approach to parenting, and really more than just parenting, to life. But we talk a lot about the Christian worldview because number one, the Christian worldview is true. But number two, when we think worldviewishly, it helps us to connect the dots. It helps us to make sense of things. And it also then motivates our action in a couple of ways by giving us the right things to do, but then also giving us the strength of conviction, the courage to do what we need to do when we need to do it. In fact, I want to read a quote from Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer is I think a lot of people who are familiar with Worldview would be familiar with Francis Schaeffer, Christian thinker from 70s and 80s, passed away, I think, in the early 80s, wrote some really tremendous books, very prophetic in, I think, looking at the culture and the impact of ideas in the culture. But this is what he says, and I believe this is in the book, The Great Evangelical Disaster, which is an interesting read. But he says, the basic problem of the Christians in this country in the last 80 years or so, in regard to society and in regard to government, is that they have seen things in bits and pieces instead of totals. They have gradually become disturbed over permissiveness, pornography, the public schools, the breakdown of the family, and finally abortion. But they have not seen this as a totality, each thing being a part, a symptom of a much larger problem. They have failed to see that all of this has come about due to a shift in worldview. That is, through a fundamental change in the overall way people think and view the world and life as a whole. And so he's outlining the problem that Christians have. We approach things in bits and pieces. So, for instance, when it comes to discipline, we simply approach the area of discipline without thinking of the larger worldview, the totality. And I think this is why oftentimes we're ineffective, because we haven't thought through the ideas very well. We haven't looked at the larger framework, the larger worldview when it comes to something like discipline. And then we lose coherence, right? We lose how these things fit, and then we lose that motivation. So that's why we have not jumped right into the practical steps of discipline, because we've got to lay out a larger framework, and it might take us 3 or 4 or 5 podcasts to do so. But then if we do that, I think we're going to have a really solid foundation on which we can build all those practical steps. And because you have a whole talk that you do on the practical steps. So we've got a lot of practical steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that quote from Schaeffer, and that the bits and pieces thing does remind me of, he listed some cultural thing in the 80s, permissiveness, pornography, abortion. And of course, today we would add more to that. And we did, I think a good example of this is why we did like a 3-part series on gender, because we cannot take this issue of gender, the transgender movement, just as that little movement, as if it's not trying to reframe the entire way that we look at ourselves. And so it is so important, even in this topic of discipline, to step back, to look at how in totality we view human beings and how that informs then how we view our children and everything about it, our relationship with our children, how we view they should be trained. And then if we don't understand these ideas, how on earth could we pass it on to our kids? And if we pass on little bits and pieces that aren't connected or tethered to these bigger ideas and really frame out an entire worldview for our kids that includes all of life, well, then we risk losing them because it just seems like, oh, well, I don't agree with you on the transgender thing, so I just toss it out. Oh, I don't agree with you, Mom and Dad, on discipline, so I just toss it out, whatever. So it's that little bits and pieces, I think, is a really good way to think about it, which is why we're not running to the practical of it.
Yeah, and maybe here's a helpful way to think about it as well, is that your worldview kind of provides an anchor for the bits and pieces, is one possible analogy, because I think you're right. today, a lot of young people struggle with the Christian answers to particular issues, but that's because all we've done is talk about gender identity, or we've just talked about homosexuality, or we've talked about, whatever the moral issue is in isolation. And we haven't laid out the larger framework that makes sense and kind of anchors that and forms this coherent web of beliefs that hangs together. And so, so that's what we want to do, is build a little bit more on that foundation. In fact, I think a way that you can maybe see how Christians don't have this framework, don't have that, is by taking those bits and pieces and asking what they're for. So for instance, ask a Christian, what is marriage for? And I would guess that most Christians are going to struggle answering that. You're going to see them kind of mentally struggling to answer that. Or what is discipline for? Right? And so what we want to try and help do is make sense of that with that larger framework. So with that, we kind of, the first two podcasts, we dealt with a couple of the lies, tried to untangle ourselves from some of the lies of the culture. And then now we want to get to the starting point. Where do we start? Because it's not merely taking down bad ideas. We want to build good ideas and build a foundation.
Yeah. And so just thinking about building, I think one example I've heard you give a lot about in Worldview is the idea of a puzzle. And I've used this too now because I think it's so good. But what we want to do is build that framework of a puzzle. It's this idea of you get a puzzle in a box and you dump it all out and it's a total mess. And if you think about it as all these things that are going on in the culture. So you have this mess of a puzzle. So what do you always do first when you start a puzzle? If you want to really build it, is you start with the edges. You start with the frame of it. So we want to start building that frame of the puzzle. So then when we talk about
the individual puzzle pieces,
like rules, like why we would do this type of discipline with our kids, then it makes sense in the puzzle and you're connecting it to this outer framework. So that's what we want to do in this podcast, is talk about kind of the frame of the puzzle.
Yeah. And so discipline, our view of discipline in the Christian worldview starts with God. And that's so much. I mean, everything goes back to God. And in fact, the more I think worldviewishly about stuff, the more I realize that first kind of fundamental worldview question of origin, which is the question, where did we come from? That is the vital starting point for everything. Everything kind of flows from that. Where you come from tells you about who you are, why you're here, what you should be doing, and where you're going to go, right? So developing very strong convictions about who God is, what his nature is, why we, believe that he is real, why it's the God of the Bible is so important. But discipline starts with God, because God has created us, and the kind of God that he's a moral being, right? And in fact, we can simply know he's a moral being by just observing the world around us. We observe a moral universe all around us. And whether you agree on particular moral views, we all will hold, or at least live consistently with the idea that there are things that are really right and wrong, even when we deny those things. C.S. Lewis talks about this in the first part of Mere Christianity, and it turns out to be an argument for God's existence. Morality points to a moral law giver. And so in the Christian worldview, God is the source of all morality. Philosophers would say he's the grounding for morality. And because of that, there's this natural moral order to the universe that's grounded in God's moral nature. And so we live in a universe that is fundamentally a moral place. Sometimes people say, moral laws and moral obligations are simply the furniture of the universe. Whether you believe it or not, right? These are objective features of the universe. There are moral facts, and the standard turns out to be God's moral nature, right? So that's the kind of starting point. And it's vital for us to get clear on what the implications and what this means. This means that there are objective moral truths. And we live in such a relativistic culture, which it's relativistic in some ways, in other ways it's not. There's just all kinds of inconsistency. But there is this impulse, this first impulse in a lot of people to say, hey, your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth, and live and let live. At the end of the day, your views on sexuality or whatever moral issue it is turn out to just be preferences. You've got your preferences, I've got mine. It's subjective. And when we start from a place that there is a moral being, God, who exists, who's brought everything into existence, and morality is built into the universe, and that this morality is objective in nature, then this subjectivism is inconsistent with that and is a false view and will undermine our discipline.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, if a parent isn't convinced of this objective moral law, or maybe we would give lip service to it, but we've never really made sense of that or gotten good reasons on why that is. We could live as relativists. And so this then would come out in our discipline, because we wouldn't be disciplining our kids towards this objective good. It's actually good to treat other people this way. It's actually good to have self-control. It's good to submit to authority, these types of things. Then if you bring that in, then it will just be whatever, maybe small discipline you do at home, it will quickly unravel once your kids are able to think on their own and see that your ideas or your rules or whatever are really based on nothing but your personal preference. And then they'll think, well, my preference is the opposite.
Yeah. And think about how we approach preferences, right? We don't approach them with this deep conviction. It's not like we're going to fight for our preferences no matter what. I've got preferences in ice cream. You've got preferences in ice cream. Your preferences are wrong. Mine are right. No, we laugh about that because we know at the end of the day, if I say, yeah, Reese's peanut butter cup ice cream is my favorite ice cream, well, that's just a subjective preference. And if someone disagrees, if one of the kids doesn't agree that Reese's peanut butter cup ice cream is the best kind of ice cream, well, after putting him in timeout, no, I'm just kidding. There is no discipline for that because it's just merely a preference. And so notice, if you view something as merely a preference, it will I won't say undermine. It will cause you to approach it differently. Now, if you view morality as a preference, that will undermine your discipline of your kids, because it turns out, well, it's not something that's objectively right and wrong, whether you believe it or not. It's more of, I have this preference, or I don't like when my kid does this, or I don't like when my kid does that. In fact, we ought to think carefully about how the language that we use. We talk in preferential language, and it reveals our views. Like, I don't like this or I don't like that, versus that thing is wrong. And so,
Yeah, actually, I think that the language part is really good, because I think this moving away from like, because I said so as parents, now when they're little, like a 2-year-old can't understand the rationale of why they need to get to bed, but they need to. And so not that you rationalize with them, but sometimes it is, mommy told you to do this, you need to go do this. But this, it's because I said so, and that's why you do it. If we don't move past that, especially as our kids get older, instead of because it's right, because it's wrong. That's why you don't do that.
Yeah.
That language part it could undermine without us, even knowing.
Yeah. So I think we want to encourage you to watch your language. Sorry, that was a bad joke.
Okay, so
Bad
thinking about God's moral law and his order and the furniture of the universe, like you talked about.
And there's these objective moral laws and values that exist in the universe because of God. Mm-hmm. This is why we start with God. Then, all right, now let's keep building out that framework.
Yeah.
How are we moving our way towards discipline?
Yeah. So one thing that we discover about God, especially through the scriptures, is he has this moral law, which is based out of his own character. And then out of that, he has structured our world as human beings. He's structured our relationships to one another. And he's kind of given us 4 main structures for relationships and how kind of this authority and discipline stuff works itself out. Because we all need discipline, it turns out. So he's in the scriptures, it's kind of broken up into 4 different categories. So the first one that God has established is the parent-child relationship. And this is the first human relationship that we learn about God's moral laws, about discipline, and where we learn right and wrong is from parents. And parents are over children, and parents are to teach their children these things. The second one is the church over believers. And so God structured it that we all should submit to authority of a local church body who knows us, that there's leaders there, and that we are under their teaching and authority, and we submit to that. The third one is masters over employees or bosses over employees, teachers over students, this type of thing. So you can see we're kind of moving out. We start in the home, go to the church, now you go to job, or,
society.
Yeah, society. And then the last one, the fourth one that God has established is government over citizens from Romans 13. And then we would argue that that order we place them in is actually order of sovereignty. So parent over child, the family is the highest sovereignty, where you're going to learn those things, has the most amount of authority in your life. Then
and is the proper place for that.
Yeah.
Like it's, and I think that's an important concept, these different spheres of sovereignty, because it's not the role of the government. It's not the primary group or individual is not government to raise the kid. No, God has set it up that the parents are sovereign in the realm of child rearing and child raising.
Yeah. And then the church, and then we would argue that these spheres of sovereignty build family, church, work, society, and then government out of that.
And so these are different areas of authority that God has placed in the world, really to help us know his moral law. Right. So this is where we can kind of, a Christian worldview helps us to see how everything is kind of God-bathed. Like, there's not an area of reality that we can kind of separate off from our Christian worldview. But that even the very structure of the world and the universe and family and society actually is going to point us back to God. And so these authorities that God has set up are there to help us understand God's moral law and ultimately then how to submit to God's moral law. So these things and these structures are training us towards obedience. Obedience to who? Well, obedience to God. And if there is no God, then obedience to who is a good question. There is no obedience to anyone out there. It's not like you have obedience to just some, cold Darwinian, universe, if there is no God, then there's no objective moral truth out there that I have to aim for. It's like I get to decide, and so so these authorities and structures are really important to think through, and so now that's the proper context to think about our kids in discipline.
Yeah, and I think these structures too, just as I think about it, I think it's important for us to think of them as good. Like these are good structures that God has put into our lives as human beings, because it's not just children that need discipline and authority. It turns out we all need that as rebellious human beings. So God has placed these, this furniture, this order for our good. And so it's good to see it that way. Now, sometimes, especially you think of government, and people often don't think, wow, this is a good thing that God has done. Well, why? Because then what happens is we bring in, our experiences into this, and we can bring in, some of these negative ideas that we develop about authority.
Because of our negative experiences.
Yeah. We'll start with government, but we could all list off quickly corrupt politicians.
Just think of that word. Think of that word politician for a moment.
Yeah.
And what are your first initial thoughts and feelings when you hear politician?
Yeah, a lot of words, and so yeah, we can.
Are you thinking curse words right now? You're a sinner.
No, I wasn't thinking curse words. I'm just thinking words that are bad, like like
bad words. Bad words. Okay, not curse words. Bad words.
Okay, so
no, here. This is part of the Christian worldview. Human nature is flawed and sinful. That's part of, we talked about in one of these.
Well, okay. So on a serious note, though, you think about, we could think about the American presidents that go in and out, to every 4 years or every year they change. So you think about the presidents that you like, and you're happy to submit to their authority. You're happy to do the things that they want to do. And then the presidents we don't like, we're like, no, we don't. And we push against that, and I'm not talking about.
Do you want to name the presidents that you don't like? Do you want to reveal your political hand
go
right now?
Through all 46 of them? No. But so that's what I mean. We can bring in our even our rebellious nature, but also our bad experiences. And let's talk about, like legitimate pain maybe that you have from your parents who did not discipline well, or maybe you have, abuse in your past. And so this is going to affect you deeply, and can really, then if you hear a word like authority and you've been abused by someone in authority, that's a tough thing to to get a proper view, and going back to my idea of that, this is good. These authorities are good, but if we've been mistreated by authorities, we can think, well, this is not good.
Well, because then you might equate discipline with your experience of it.
Yeah.
So you had an abusive maybe father or something. Then you think of the word discipline, and it just carries all of this baggage. Yeah. And you don't think of authority as a good thing. And this is why we need the Christian worldview to reshape those thoughts. And we don't want to, this is where we can't be led merely by our experiences, but why we have to be led by biblical truth. Because we all have bad experiences. We live in a broken world with a bunch of broken human beings, not just broken, but rebellious human beings. We're all, the world is corrupted by sin. And so that affects every single one of us. And so this might be, that's, I think, something that is important for us as parents to reflect on. And we've done that. And we talk about how even when we did some premarital counseling with a professional counselor, one of the most helpful things that we did in counseling was unpack some of just kind of family patterns. And look, your family has some bad patterns, my family has some bad patterns. Guess what? Everybody's out there. Your family has bad patterns because we're fallen human beings. And that's not to rip on our families because we have bad patterns. I mean, in particular, honey, there are some really bad patterns. No, you and I.
We'll take a vote with the kids and say who has more bad patterns, me or Dad?
Okay, that'll be a future podcast. But you and I, even as we're talking about discipline, there are bad patterns of discipline that even we are passing on to our own kids. So this is just a messy thing. But it doesn't mean that the structure that God originally intended is a bad thing. No, it's actually a good thing.
Yeah, or that God wants then the structure that he's built to be abandoned. Yeah. So if you've had a pastor that was, that did not use his authority correctly, it doesn't mean God wants you to leave the church, big church as a whole. You might need to leave that church, but so it's not like God's then, okay, you don't need any kind of accountability and authority and discipline in your life. You can just live on your own without the authority of the church. No, God has established these for our good. And so even though we experience brokenness in our relationships, this is how God has structured relationships to be.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, they're to point us back to God. Mm-hmm. And that's where we can say that discipline turns out to be a gospel issue. Mm-hmm. This is about the gospel because think about it. What we've said here is God exists. It's not just any God. It's the God of the Bible. It's Yahweh who has this moral nature, has created us as moral beings, and his moral laws as the creator of the universe, we are obligated as human beings to follow and live by. And then the story of humanity in Genesis 3 is that what do? We're lawbreakers. We break that law, and what it does is it ends up breaking our relationship with God, breaking our fellowship with God. It puts us at enmity, right? We become enemies with God. And now humanity is in need of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And so part of that reconciliation, number one, is understanding that I'm a lawbreaker, mm-hmm. that I'm a sinful human being, that I have sin to repent of. And so that's where then God has these structures in place that help us in all kinds of ways to kind of come in and try to correct us. And at the very least, it reveals to us our own sin. And so as a parent, this starts in parenting, where you're correcting the child and saying, no, this is wrong and this is right. And those first lessons of discipline end up reflecting God, because ultimately we want to point them back to God. God is the source of all moral truth and moral laws, and our obedience to him is the vital issue. But that's first learned in the context of parent and child and discipline. Mm-hmm. And so it's a gospel issue because it reveals to us our need to get right mm-hmm. with God as lawbreakers, ones who have been disobedient to his law. And so even in discipline, then it can point us to the need for Christ. Mm-hmm. So this is, when we think, I think, through it Christianly, discipline is a gospel issue.
Okay, so let's pause for a minute and define this word discipline, because we're throwing it around a lot, and we assume people know what we mean by it. But let's just be really clear, define it. So definition of discipline, what we're talking about is training that corrects, molds, or perfects mental faculties or moral character. So this is what we're talking about: training, correcting.
That might be a good, concise way to put it. Training that corrects. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty broad, but I think it will, we'll get more into the details. But that's just a great, simple definition for folks out there. Is discipline is training that corrects.
Yeah, and I think that's a biblical definition. I think as we study the word discipline throughout the scriptures, Old and New Testament, this is what discipline means. And so why don't we...
Yeah, I think you've got some good verses here. Maybe you want to hit a couple of these verses and then maybe then hit Hebrews 12.
Okay. Okay. So
because I think it's important for maybe even you guys out there right now who are listening and hearing this to maybe pull out your Bible right now and to look at some of these passages versus just us quoting them. But it's good for us to know where in Scripture there is specific teaching on discipline.
Yeah. So I mentioned Old and New Testament. So we'll start in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 8, 5 through 6. This is Moses, last teaching to the Israelites before they go to the Promised Land. And he's talking to them about why God has disciplined them. What one big discipline he did was, instead of getting to go to the Promised Land, they had to stay in the desert for 40 years. And that was a discipline. So Moses is speaking to them and says, thus you are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you just as a man disciplines his son. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and to fear him. So this references the Lord's discipline and then references just like a man does for his son, just like parents do for their children. This is how the Lord disciplines us.
Yeah, and he refers to verse 6. After talking about discipline, observe the commands of the Lord, right? So even in our discipline of our kids, we always want to remember that the discipline I give to my kids is not just so they'll obey me or my rules. It's actually to be preparing their heart and mind to live in obedience to the Lord. And so thinking of our discipline as not just, hey, you're going to do what I say, you're going to obey mom and dad. No, ultimately, this is training in righteousness. This is training to correct your sinful desires against the Lord, not just against mom and dad.
Yeah. Job 5 is another one. Job 5:17 says, behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. Do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. So just another example of the word discipline being used as how God disciplines us to train us in righteousness, to that obeying him is part of, the discipline in our lives that we need to learn.
And it's good.
And it's good. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to read the Hebrews passage? I
think the Hebrews passage would be a good one to kind of wrap this episode up with. Hebrews chapter 12. And God is here talking about, the writer of Hebrews is talking about God disciplining us. And he draws that parallel with a parent and a child. So let me read Hebrews chapter 12, verses 4 through 11. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. So I'll just pause there. There's the motivation. The motivation for disciplining our own children should be love. The motivation that God has for disciplining us is love. Because when we love someone, a proper view of love is not just affirmation. It's not just acceptance, right? But it's desiring and seeking to obtain the good of someone else as far as you can, right? So you've got a view that there is a proper way to live or to behave, and you're trying to help your kids reach that, and it's out of love. Verse 7, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good. So it's out of love and it's for our good. What's that good? In verse 10, the second half of verse 10, in order that we may share in his holiness. His discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So it's training to correct so that we become more like God, so that we can grow in holiness and righteousness. And notice, it talks about a harvest of righteousness and peace, because those who live according to the nature of the universe, the moral nature of the universe, when we live in harmony with God's moral laws, we find peace. We find a greater sense of happiness and well-being. I think the word that captures it is flourishing. And so when we discipline our children, we need to have this in mind. And notice when we have a Christian worldview about discipline, it's motivating. And it gives us the strength and courage to carry out this difficult task. When you have a clear view that you are disciplining your kid, number one, out of love, ultimately to point them back to the creator of the universe, God himself, to live according to his laws, because the way that God has designed the universe and the way he's designed humanity is that when we live and function morally, when we live according to his laws, we flourish. We're designed to flourish by living in obedience to God. And so discipline is ultimately, the goal of discipline is to help our kids live in obedience to God. And so when we have those deep convictions, I think it'll give us the motivation and the courage and the strength to push forward in discipline.
Yeah, because it's good. We see that discipline is good.
Yeah, and that's why it's vital that we think about this from a Christian worldview. So we are going to keep thinking through it, and eventually we're going to then get some really practical help.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.